All right, let's jump right into it because today we're looking at something absolutely fascinating. We're stepping completely away from the political pundits, the campaign speeches, and the personal opinions. Instead, we're diving straight into pure, unyielding mathematics. This explainer is a forensic data investigation into the June 1st, 2025 Polish presidential election. We're going to look at how data analysts treat an election, not just as a political event, but as a massive mathematical data set. You see, when an election involves millions of people, the numbers are supposed to behave in highly predictable ways. But what happens when they don't? What happens when the math starts practically screaming that something is fundamentally wrong? Well, let's find out. So, can mathematics actually prove or disprove a stolen election? Right after the second round of voting between Karol Nawrocki and Rafał Trzaskowski, there were a ton of media reports and allegations flying around. The claims specifically pointed to two major things happening in certain electoral commissions: the switching of votes between candidates and the sudden addition of invalid votes. Now, physical recounts in a few scattered places did actually confirm some of these issues. But as objective analysts, we have to ask, were these just isolated human errors or part of something much larger? We don't necessarily need to open every single ballot box to find out. We really just need to look at the aggregate data. Now, the core of this whole approach hinges on one really important concept. Look, human error happens in literally every election. Someone makes a mistake counting, maybe a ballot gets misread. These are random errors. And in statistics, random isolated errors just cancel each other out when you average the data over thousands of municipalities. They basically disappear into the background noise. But if an error is intentional, systemic, and happening at a massive scale, it doesn't just disappear, it compounds. It leaves this massive, undeniable statistical footprint at higher aggregate levels, like your municipalities and counties. And when those footprints get too large, we cross the threshold into what's known as a statistical impossibility. Let's look at Exhibit A, the distribution gap. Okay, so picture this. In the second round of a presidential election, you essentially have a brand new pool of votes up for grabs, right? These come from a general increase in voter turnout and from voters whose preferred candidates got eliminated in the first round. Both of the remaining candidates are obviously fighting for a piece of this new pie. Now, on average, across the entire country, this new pool of votes split like this. Karol Nawrocki captured 64% of the new votes, and Rafał Trzaskowski captured about 35%. That is our baseline. Perfectly normal. But the thing is, averages can completely hide extreme local distortions. So the absolutely crucial point here is what happens when analysts looked at how those averages were actually built across individual municipalities. This right here is what the source report considers a mathematical smoking gun. Analysts looked at every single municipality, or gmina, to see who dominated that new vote pool. In 34% of all municipalities, Nawrocki captured more than 70% of the entirely new vote pool. But Trzaskowski, he achieved that exact same feat of capturing over 70% of the new votes in exactly 0 municipalities. Literally not a single one. You really have to ask yourself, is a 34% to 0% gap a natural phenomenon? Think about it. In a national election featuring a highly polarized, split electorate, you'd totally expect that both candidates would have strongholds where they dominate the incoming vote. But for one candidate to completely monopolize the new votes in over a third of the country's districts, while the other candidate fails to do that anywhere at all, in statistics, a distribution that deeply skewed strongly suggests a targeted, non-random distortion. According to the analysts, the numbers are behaving exactly as if votes were somehow siphoned from one side to the other. To put that into even sharper perspective, when you look at municipalities where a candidate's total vote count grew by more than 100% between the first and second rounds, Nawrocki received this massive doubling growth in 18.3% of districts. Trzaskowski, only 9%. So Nawrocki received exactly double the amount of hypergrowth districts. When you look at the data from a bird's eye view like this, the mathematical balance of the election is entirely asymmetrical. But as fascinating as this distribution gap is, the forensic data tells an even stranger story when we look somewhere else. Moving on to Exhibit B, the Invalid Vote Anomaly. 121.3%. No, that's not a candidate's growth. This is the dramatic, really intense spike in the number of entirely invalid votes between the first and second rounds of the election. And frankly, this is absurdly unusual. Generally speaking, second rounds of elections are way simpler for the voter. I mean, you only have two choices, right? That makes it much harder to accidentally spoil a ballot. And yet, the data shows an absolute explosion of invalid voting. Let's break down the raw numbers behind that massive percentage. In round one, across all of Poland, there were just under 84,000 invalid votes. In round two, that number skyrocketed to over 185,000. That is a difference of more than 101,000 completely new, invalid ballots suddenly appearing in the system over the course of just a few weeks. The obvious question the data analysts asked here is, where did all these invalid votes come from, and more importantly, who did they actually affect? To figure that out, we have to look at how these invalid votes interacted with the candidate's performance. We measure this using something called a correlation coefficient, usually just denoted as R. It's basically a scale from -1 to +1. If it's a positive number, it means two things are rising together. If it's a negative number, one goes up while the other goes down. If these invalid votes were just random mistakes made by clumsy voters, they should have absolutely zero correlation to whether Trzaskowski or Nawrocki was doing well in any specific county.
But when you plot the change in invalid votes against the change in a candidate's votes at the county level, the two variables form completely divergent trend lines. I mean, they are moving in totally opposite directions. This mathematically proves that the surge in invalid votes was absolutely not a random accident scattered equally across the country. It was inextricably linked to the performance of specific candidates.
And here is the exact mathematical finding behind those trend lines. At the county level, Rafał Trzaskowski has a really strong positive correlation of plus 0.63 with rising invalid votes. Karol Nawrocki has a negative correlation of minus 0.41. What does that actually mean in plain English? It means that in the specific areas where Trzaskowski's support was growing the strongest, the number of invalid thrown-out ballots mysteriously spiked. And in the exact areas where Nawrocki was surging, the rate of invalid ballots actually shrank.
Now, you might be thinking, hey, maybe this is just a weird local quirk. Well, actually, this exact same pattern holds true even when we zoom all the way out to the macro scale, the Voivodeship level, which is basically the state or provincial level in Poland. The surge in invalid votes tracks tightly with Trzaskowski's vote changes, while almost totally ignoring Nawrocki's. The statistical footprint we're looking at here is vast. It's highly structured, and the analysts emphasize it is absolutely not an accident. Which brings us to the final section, the mathematical conclusion. Okay, we've gone through a lot of dense data today. We've got Exhibit A, that wildly skewed distribution gap, where one candidate captures massive portions of the electorate, while the other captures literally zero. And we have Exhibit B, a 121% spike in invalid votes that surgically correlates to the counties where the trailing candidate was trying to gain ground. When the source analysts combine these findings, this is the aggregate proof they derived. First, these incidents of vote switching and invalidations were not random, and they weren't isolated to a few messy precincts. Second, the sheer scale of these anomalies was so intense that they heavily impacted the aggregate national-level data. And finally, from a purely objective mathematical standpoint, the probability of both of these heavily skewed, deeply correlated trends occurring naturally in a fair election effectively approaches 0%. The report essentially concludes that the statistical integrity of the final number is fundamentally broken. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought taken directly from the conclusion of this forensic source report. Without a physical recount, the objective result of the second round cannot be established. You see, data can only tell us that the mathematical rules of reality have been broken. It can point to exactly where the footprint of an anomaly exists. But when an entire national system reaches the level of statistical impossibility, only a physical audit of the paper can actually restore the truth. So what do you think happens when a nation's math no longer adds up? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the data.